The morning mist clings to the barbed wire like ghosts refusing to leave. It's October 1943, somewhere in rural America, where rows of hastily constructed barracks stretch toward a horizon painted grey by war. This is Camp Hearn, Texas, one of hundreds of prisoner-of-war facilities scattered across the American heartland, far from the Mediterranean battlefields where these men once fought. Here, behind double fences topped with razor wire, 2,000 Italian soldiers wake each day to the sound of American bugles and the bitter taste of defeat. They are the forgotten casualties of Mussolini's collapsed empire, men who surrendered not to cowardice, but to the inevitable tide of history that swept their homeland into chaos. The camp sprawls like a small city, complete with mess halls, workshops, and recreation areas. But for all its organized efficiency, it cannot mask the profound loneliness that settles over the compound each evening like dust. These prisoners, boys really, most barely 20, wear faded grey uniforms marked with the letters PW painted in stark white across their backs. They are enemies of the state, yet they tend victory gardens, repair farm equipment, and labour alongside American workers who sometimes forget to hate them. But there is something else in the air this morning. Something that cuts through the autumn chill and the perpetual scent of homesickness. It drifts from the camp kitchen, a wooden building positioned near the centre of the compound, its chimney already releasing thin streams of smoke into the pale sky. Fresh bread. Real bread, not the hard biscuits and canned rations that have sustained these men through months of captivity. The aroma reaches Antonio Benedetti as he stands in formation with his fellow prisoners, awaiting work assignments. At 22, Antonio carries himself with the quiet dignity of a man who has seen too much too soon. His dark eyes, once bright with the promise of adventure, now hold the weight of surrender and exile. He breathes deeply, and for just a moment the scent of baking bread transports him beyond the fence, beyond the war, to his mother's kitchen in Naples, where Sunday mornings began with the sound of her humming and the warmth of fresh pane pugliese. But this is not Naples, this is Texas, and the woman creating these moments of unexpected comfort is not his mother. She is someone entirely different, someone whose presence in this place of confinement will soon challenge everything Antonio thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the invisible boundaries that war draws between human hearts. The path that brought Antonio Benedetti to this Texas camp began thousands of miles away, in the olive groves and ancient hills of Italy, where young men once dreamed of glory under Mussolini's banner. He had enlisted in 1941, barely 19, swept up in the fervour of a nation convinced it was destined for greatness. The Mediterranean was to be Italy's sea, North Africa its empire, and Antonio, like so many of his generation, believed he was marching toward history. Instead, he marched toward humiliation. By 1943, the dream had crumbled into nightmare. Rommel's Africa Corps was in retreat, Sicily had fallen to Allied forces, and Mussolini himself had been arrested by his own government. When American and British forces landed on the Italian mainland, entire divisions simply melted away. Some soldiers fled to the mountains to join partisan fighters. Others returned to their villages to await whatever came next. But thousands, including Antonio, found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and faced with a terrible choice: die for a cause they no longer believed in, or surrender to an uncertain fate. Antonio chose life. On a dusty field outside Salerno, he laid down his rifle and raised his hands toward the American soldiers advancing through the smoke. Within weeks, he was aboard a Liberty ship bound for America, crowded into the hold with hundreds of other Italian prisoners, all of them wondering if they would ever see home again. The journey across the Atlantic took 12 days. 12 days to contemplate the meaning of defeat, to write letters they weren't sure would ever be delivered, and to imagine what awaited them in the land of their captors. Some prisoners spoke of America with awe, a place of unimaginable wealth and freedom. Others whispered darker fears of work camps and revenge. The truth, as Antonio would discover, lay somewhere in between American prisoner O. F. War camps were governed by the Geneva Convention, which meant adequate food, medical care, and protection from abuse. The United States, unlike Germany or Japan, treated its prisoners with a formality that bordered on courtesy. But no treaty could address the deeper wounds of separation and uncertainty. These men were not just prisoners. They were exiles, cut off from everything that had given their lives meaning. Antonio's days in Camp Hearn followed a rigid routine: morning roll call, work details, meals, recreation time, and lights out at 10 o'clock sharp. He learned to repair engines in the motor pool, to speak broken English with his guards, and to suppress the homesickness that sometimes hit him like a physical blow. Letters from home arrived sporadically, often censored so heavily they resembled Swiss cheese. News of the war filtered through camp newspapers, each headline a reminder that the world was moving forward without them. Yet it was in this place of suspended time and muted hope that Antonio would discover something he had never expected to find: a reason to believe in tomorrow. Her name was Mary Catherine Sullivan, and she arrived at Camp Hearn each morning at 5:30 sharp, long before the prisoners stirred in their barracks. At 31, Mary Catherine moved through the camp kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had spent half her life feeding others. Her auburn hair was always pinned back in a practical bun, her apron spotless despite the chaos of preparing meals for 2,000 men. To the guards who knew her, she was simply the head cook, a local woman hired to manage the camp's food service. To the prisoners who glimpsed her through the serving windows, she was something more mysterious, a figure of feminine grace in a world stripped of softness. Mary Catherine had not planned to work in a prison camp. Born and raised in nearby Bryan, Texas, she had married her high school sweetheart, James Sullivan, in 1932. They had dreamed of children, of a farm, of growing old together on the land that had shaped their families for generations. But James had died in a factory accident in 1940, leaving Mary Catherine widowed at 28, with no children and a mortgage she could barely manage on a secretary's salary. When the war came, it brought unexpected opportunities for women willing to take on jobs traditionally held by men. The position at Camp Hearn paid well, better than anything else available to a woman in rural Texas. Mary Catherine applied not out of patriotic duty, but out of simple necessity. She needed work, and the army needed someone who could turn government rations into meals that wouldn't spark a riot among homesick Italian prisoners. What she hadn't expected was how the work would affect her. These men, boys really, reminded her of her younger brother who had died at Guadalcanal, or her cousin who had been missing in action since the Battle of the Bulge. When she looked through the serving window and saw their faces, she didn't see enemies. She saw sons writing letters to mothers they might never see again, husbands carrying photographs of wives who were learning to live without them. It was against regulations to show favoritism to prisoners. The camp commandant had made that clear during her orientation. But regulations couldn't govern the impulse that led Mary Catherine to bake fresh bread instead of serving day-old loaves, or to add an extra ladle of gravy to the plates of men who looked particularly thin. Small acts of kindness, she told herself. Nothing more. The first time she noticed Antonio Benedetti was on a Tuesday morning in late October. He was working kitchen duty that week, one of the rotating assignments that brought prisoners into direct contact with the cooking staff. While other prisoners grabbed their portions and hurried away, Antonio lingered at the serving window. He had learned enough English to say thank you and please, but there was something in his eyes that needed no translation. Recognition. Not of her face, but of her humanity in a place where such recognition was dangerous. Their first exchange was wordless. A nod, a small smile, a moment of connection that lasted no longer than it took to fill a bowl with soup. But in that moment, something shifted in the careful order of Camp Hearn, something neither of them was prepared to acknowledge or resist. The transformation began with small gestures, so subtle that even the most observant guard might have missed them. A piece of cornbread wrapped in clean paper and slipped beneath a dinner plate. An extra portion of meat that somehow found its way onto Antonio's tray. A cup of real coffee, not the chicory substitute served to most prisoners, left steaming on the kitchen counter where he might find it during his work detail. Antonio responded in kind, though his gifts were necessarily modest. A wooden spoon he had carved during recreation time, its handle smoothed to perfection by patient hands. Wildflowers picked from the camp's perimeter during outdoor work details and left on the kitchen windowsill. Once, a small sketch he had drawn on the back of a letter from home, a view of the Bay of Naples as seen from his family's apartment, complete with fishing boats and morning light dancing on the water. These exchanges required careful choreography. The kitchen operated under constant supervision, with American soldiers monitoring food preparation and distribution to prevent smuggling or sabotage. But supervision, Antonio and Mary Catherine learned, was not the same as surveillance. Guards grew accustomed to routine, their attention drifting during the endless repetition of meals served and cleaned up. In those moments of inattention, hearts found ways to speak. Their first real conversation happened during a November rainstorm that kept outdoor work details inside. Antonio had been assigned to help repair a broken oven, work that required him to spend the entire afternoon in the kitchen. For hours they worked in proximity, sharing the same air, the same purpose, the same awareness of each other's presence. When Mary Catherine asked him to hold a flashlight while she examined the oven's wiring, their hands touched briefly, a contact so fleeting it might have been accidental, yet so electric that both of them froze. "You have family in Italy?" Mary Catherine asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the rain drumming on the kitchen roof. "Si. Yes," Antonio replied, his English careful but earnest. "Madre, mother. Two sister. They in Napoli. Naples. Do you miss them?" Antonio's smile was sad but warm. "Every day. But here—" He gestured around the kitchen, then looked at her directly. "Here is not so bad as I think." The conversation that followed was halting, punctuated by language barriers and the constant need to appear focused on their work. But they managed to share fragments of their stories. Mary Catherine learned that Antonio had been a mechanic before the war, that he loved American jazz music, that he worried constantly about his family's safety in occupied Naples. Antonio discovered that Mary Catherine was a widow, that she had never travelled more than 50 miles from her birthplace, that she sometimes sang to herself while cooking, old Irish ballads her grandmother had taught her. By the time the oven was repaired, something irreversible had happened. They had seen each other not as prisoner and guard, not as enemy and American, but as two people whose loneliness had found an unexpected cure. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last pretense that their connection was merely professional courtesy. That night, Antonio lay in his bunk, listening to the whispered conversations of his fellow prisoners and thinking about the sound of Mary Catherine's laughter. 50 feet away, Mary Catherine sat at her kitchen table, staring at the wildflowers on her windowsill and wondering what she was allowing herself to feel. Both of them understood that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The letter arrived on a cold December morning, hidden inside a loaf of bread like a secret folded into dough. Antonio discovered it during his lunch break, his fingers finding the piece of paper wrapped in waxed cloth and tucked into the heel of the loaf Mary Catherine had set aside for him. His heart hammered as he unfolded the note, written in careful English on paper torn from a recipe book. "Antonio, I know this is wrong, but I cannot stop thinking about our conversations. You make me feel less alone in this place. If you want to write back, leave your note in the empty flour sack behind the pantry. I will find it. Please be careful. MC." For 3 days, Antonio carried the letter with him, memorizing every word, every loop of her handwriting, every sign that his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. He wrote his reply in the margins of an Italian newspaper, his words a mixture of English, Italian, and emotions that transcended language barriers. Cara Mary Catherine, you make my heart sing like music from home. This place is prison, but when I see you, I forget the fence, forget the guards, forget everything except that you are beautiful and kind. I think about you when I wake, when I sleep, when I eat the bread you make with such care. Is it possible to love someone you barely know? I think yes, because I think I love you. Antonio. Their correspondence continued through the winter, a delicate dance of hidden messages and stolen moments. Mary Catherine would leave notes tucked into flour sacks or wrapped around kitchen utensils. Antonio responded with letters written on whatever paper he could find, margins of books, backs of official camp notices, even pieces of cardboard salvaged from supply boxes. They wrote about their past lives, their fears for the future, their growing certainty that what they felt for each other had moved far beyond friendship or wartime sympathy. But secrets, like smoke, have a way of revealing themselves. The first sign of trouble came in January 1944, when Sergeant Miller, the camp's security officer, began asking questions about food distribution. Several guards had noticed that certain prisoners seemed better fed than others, that portions were sometimes uneven, that supplies occasionally went missing from the kitchen. Miller was a career soldier who had seen service in North Africa before being assigned to Camp Hearn. He understood that maintaining discipline among prisoners required vigilance against any sign of favoritism or fraternization. The investigation began quietly. Guards were instructed to pay closer attention to the kitchen staff and prisoner work details. Meal distributions were monitored more carefully. Random searches of prisoner quarters increased. Miller didn't suspect romance. Such a possibility seemed too unlikely to consider seriously. But he sensed that someone was breaking regulations, and he was determined to identify the source of the problem. The crisis came to a head on a February afternoon when Antonio's bunkmate Giuseppe Torretti noticed him reading a letter written in English. Giuseppe was a bitter man, angry about his captivity, and suspicious of any prisoner who seemed to be adapting too well to camp life. When he saw Antonio quickly hide the letter, his imagination filled with possibilities for betrayal and collaboration. That evening, Giuseppe approached Sergeant Miller with a story about Antonio receiving mysterious communications, possibly from American contacts outside the camp. The accusation was vague but alarming enough to trigger a formal investigation. Within hours, Antonio's belongings were being searched, his recent activities scrutinized, his associations with camp staff examined with new suspicion. The net was closing around a love affair that had bloomed in the most unlikely soil, nurtured by two hearts that had forgotten to consider the consequences of feeling too deeply in a world at war. The interrogation room was bare except for a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a single light bulb that cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Antonio sat across from Sergeant Miller, his hands folded in his lap, his face betraying none of the fear that gripped his chest like a vice. For 2 hours, Miller had pressed him about the letters, about his relationship with kitchen staff, about any communications he might be having with people outside the camp. "I know you're hiding something, Benedetti," Miller said, leaning forward across the table. "Letters in English, special treatment in the mess hall, extra privileges during work details. Either you're collaborating with someone on the outside, or you're getting too friendly with American personnel. Either way, it's a violation of camp regulations." Antonio chose his words carefully. "I do my work. I follow rules. I want no trouble." "Then explain these." Miller dropped several pieces of paper on the table. Notes Antonio had thought were safely hidden. Messages that had somehow been intercepted during searches he hadn't even known were happening. Across the camp, Mary Catherine was facing her own crisis. The camp commandant, Colonel Henderson, had summoned her to his office for what he called a routine review of kitchen operations. But the questions weren't routine, and Mary Catherine quickly realized that her relationship with Antonio had been discovered. "Mrs. Sullivan," Henderson said, his voice formal but not unkind, "you've been an exemplary employee for over a year. Your work has been above reproach, and the prisoners under your supervision have had no disciplinary problems related to food service. That's why I'm giving you an opportunity to explain some irregularities that have come to our attention. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Reports of uneven food distribution, observations of ex-day, indeed conversations between Mary Catherine and certain prisoners, testimony from other kitchen workers about notes and gifts being exchanged. Henderson had served long enough to recognize the signs of inappropriate fraternization, but he also understood that Mary Catherine was a valuable employee whose loss would create significant operational problems. I want you to understand something, Henderson continued. These prisoners are not our friends. They're not our guests. They are enemy combatants who surrendered rather than fight to the death. Many of them would return to fighting against American forces if given the opportunity. Any personal attachment you might feel toward them is misplaced and dangerous. Mary Catherine sat in silence, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing through possible responses. She could deny everything, claim the accusations were based on misunderstandings and coincidences. She could confess and hope for leniency. Or she could tell the truth, that she had fallen in love with a man whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of an arbitrary line drawn by politicians and generals. In the end, she chose honesty. "Colonel Henderson," she said quietly, "I believe Antonio Benedetti is a good man who was caught up in circumstances beyond his control. If showing him basic human kindness is a crime, then I suppose I'm guilty." The confession changed everything. Within hours, Antonio was transferred to solitary confinement pending a decision about his future. Mary Catherine was suspended from her position while the camp administration decided whether to file formal charges or simply dismiss her. Their carefully constructed world of stolen moments and hidden letters collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. But love, they discovered, could survive even under the watchful eyes of guards and the weight of military regulations. Spring arrived at Camp Hearn with wildflowers blooming along the fence line and news from Europe that changed everything. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the war that had consumed the world for 6 terrible years was finally ending. For the Italian prisoners, victory celebrations in the American barracks were bittersweet reminders that their own country remained occupied, divided, and uncertain about its future. Antonio had spent 3 months in solitary confinement. His contact with Mary Catherine reduced to glimpses across the compound during his supervised exercise periods. She had been reassigned to administrative duties, banned from the kitchen that had been their meeting place, their sanctuary, their world. But the end of the war brought new possibilities and new fears. Repatriation orders arrived in June 1945. The Italian prisoners would be shipped home within months, transported back to a homeland that existed now only in memory and imagination. Naples, Antonio learned from delayed letters, had been bombed extensively during the Allied invasion. His family's apartment building had been damaged but not destroyed. His mother and sisters were alive, but struggling to survive in a city where food was scarce and work even scarcer. The night before his scheduled departure, Antonio found a way to see Mary Catherine one last time. During a shift change, when guard rotations created a brief gap in surveillance, he slipped away from his barracks and made his way to the administrative building where she worked. She was waiting for him. Somehow, she had known he would come. They had perhaps 10 minutes together in the shadowy space between buildings, hidden from the searchlights that swept the compound every few hours. 10 minutes to say everything they had been unable to say during months of enforced separation. "I will write to you," Antonio promised, his English improved by months of enforced study. "I will find way to come back to America, to Texas, to you." Mary Catherine touched his face gently, memorizing the feel of his skin, the warmth of his eyes, the reality of a man she might never see again. "I'll wait," she whispered. "However long it takes, I'll wait." They kissed once, softly, desperately, a first and last kiss that carried the weight of all their unexpressed devotion. Then Antonio disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Mary Catherine alone with promises she wasn't sure either of them could keep. The next morning, buses arrived to transport the Italian prisoners to trains that would carry them to ships bound for Europe. Antonio boarded with a small suitcase containing his few possessions and a heart heavy with love and loss. As the bus pulled away from Camp Herne, he pressed his face to the window for one final glimpse of the place where he had discovered that even in captivity, the human heart could soar. Mary Catherine watched from her office window until the dust settled on the empty road. Then she returned to her desk and began planning the rest of her life around the possibility of reunion with a man who was disappearing over the horizon into an uncertain future. The letters came sporadically at first, carried across the Atlantic by postal systems still recovering from 6 years of war. Antonio wrote from Naples, describing a city scarred but not broken, a family grateful for his survival and his struggles to find work in an economy devastated by occupation and conflict. Mary Catherine responded with news from Texas, updates about the abandoned camp that was being converted back to farmland, and careful mentions of her continued employment with the county government. For 2 years, they maintained their connection through words on paper, sharing the mundane details of rebuilding their separate lives while nurturing hope for an impossible reunion. Antonio found work as a mechanic, saving every lira he could earn toward passage to America. Mary Catherine applied for immigration sponsorship, navigating bureaucratic mazes designed to reunite families, not lovers who had met in captivity. But distance, time, and the weight of practical reality began to erode what proximity and shared danger had created. Antonio's letters grew shorter, arriving less frequently. Mary Catherine met a widowed rancher named Thomas Mitchell, a kind man who offered companionship and stability, if not the passionate love she had known behind barbed wire. The last letter arrived in November 1947, written on cheap paper in Antonio's careful English. Cara Mary Catherine, I marry local girl my mother choose. She is good woman, will give me children, normal life. I never forget you, never forget what we have in that place. You must forget me now, find happiness with someone who can give you what I cannot. Always in my heart. Antonio. Mary Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box where she kept the few mementos from their brief love affair, a carved spoon, dried wildflowers, and the faded photograph of a handsome Italian soldier who had taught her that love could bloom anywhere, even in the most unlikely soil. She married Thomas Mitchell in 1948 and lived a good life, raising his children as her own, managing a household, contributing to her community. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the Texas wind whispered through the trees, she would remember the taste of fresh bread and the sound of a voice speaking her name with an accent that made ordinary words sound like poetry. Antonio Benedetti disappeared into the anonymity of post-war Italy, one of millions of men trying to forget the war and build new lives from the rubble of old dreams. Whether he ever told his wife about the woman in Texas who had shown him kindness during his darkest hours, no one knows. But in the end, perhaps that doesn't matter. Love stories don't always have happy endings. Sometimes their value lies not in their conclusion, but in their existence. Proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, hearts can still recognize each other across every boundary that hatred tries to build.